Hi guys, Barney St. Anton here from St. Anton Nutrition, and today I'm going to be talking to you about your second priority when dieting, and that is your macronutrient intake. So first of all, I want to make it perfectly clear, there is no one-size-fits-all solution to this. Everyone needs to be considered individually, and there are many factors that influence your macronutrient intake requirements. The primary factor is if your sport is biased towards strength or if it's biased towards endurance. Now this results in what I'd like to call a spectrum of requirements. Now that's just a fancy way of saying, on the one end we have sports that are biased towards strength, for example Olympic lifting, powerlifting, or throwers like shot putters or discus throwers. And on the other we have sports that are biased towards endurance. These include runners, triathletes, or marathon runners such as those that compete in the marathon des sables. In between these two extremes we have a whole array of hybrid athletes such as rugby players, football players, strongmen, rowers, who all fit in this gap between they're not really towards strength all the time and they're not really concerned with endurance all the time either. They have to have a multidisciplinary approach and consider all ends. Now even within these sports there are different comparisons between athletes. Now a classic one would be comparing a front row forward and maybe a scrum half or a fly half. They're obviously going to have different needs because of their requirements in their sport, in their different positions. Now even though we've broken it down even further, we can still break it down further by factors such as, well, is the individual going through a strength training phase? Are they focusing on their body composition for a bit? Do they need to bring up their cardio? Or are they injured? There are plenty of factors that can influence your macronutrient requirements at any time. It's important for an athlete to understand their needs at any one time, and they must consider all these factors. And it can be difficult to do this unless you have hired a nutrition coach. And I'm going to do my best to present you with the best evidence so that you may make the best decisions and judgments of your requirements yourself. So let's start by considering strength sports, because let's be honest, no one grew up wanting to be a runner, and even if you're a champion runner, deep down you're still a loser. The key macronutrient for strength athletes is protein. Now when compared to general populations, all athletes, including endurance athletes, have an enhanced requirement for protein. And this is due to the increased oxidation of amino acids and protein during exercise, as well as the need for protein in order to recover from any muscular or skeletal damage during exercise, and it also serves as a substrate for the growth of lean mass. With that in mind, the ACSM recommends an intake of 1.6 to 1.7 grams per kilogram of body weight. However, the ISSN recommends an intake of 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now, I believe this is probably the better version to go with because it matches anecdotal evidence, which in this circumstance is extremely important to consider, which suggests that 1 gram per pound of body weight is essential in order to create lean mass and in order to improve strength performance. Now these align well because 2 grams per kilogram of body weight is roughly the same as 1 gram per pound of body weight. The second macronutrient we need to consider is carbohydrates. Carbohydrate is the main substrate required for energy production, particularly in strength sports due to their nature of being short bursts of high intensity exercise, often in anaerobic conditions. There's quite an array of recommendations for carbohydrates between different nutrition organisations. I've gone with the ISSN recommendations that state you should have between 5 to 8 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now I understand this is quite a big range. For example, if you weigh 100 kilograms, the difference between 5 grams and 8 grams a day is between 300 carbs a day, and that's quite a big difference. I do think it's important to consult a nutritionist when making this decision, unless you know your body well and how you respond to high levels of carbohydrates or low levels of carbohydrates. Now last but not least, we need to consider fat. Fat is not really as important for a strength athlete as protein and carbohydrates. Its role is primarily in general health and a little bit for recovery. The recommendations for fat vary quite substantially between different nutritional organisations. They can range between 15% of your overall calorie intake to upwards of 30%. What I suggest you do is work out your daily calorie requirements, which if you haven't done already you can do by watching my previous video. Then take away your protein and carbohydrate guidelines using the table, and then with what you're left, work out your fat intake. Now this can be a great starting point. However, I do recommend you monitor this yourself, the relationship between your fat and carb intake, and find a way that suits you best. Maybe you find that high carbohydrate intake doesn't suit you. Maybe you may find dropping from 7 grams per kilogram to 6 and upping your fat might suit you better. It's all down to you to experiment. Maybe you could do this under the supervision of a nutritionist as well. Now, if you're unfortunate enough to be an endurance athlete, things are a little different. You of course do need higher levels of protein than general populations, but they're not as high as strength athletes, and that's just because you don't require as much lean mass. Generally speaking, I'm sure there are some endurance sports that may, but generally speaking, when you're comparing strength athletes and endurance athletes, there isn't as much of a need for lean mass. In some cases it can be detrimental, and so protein requirements are lower. The most important macronutrient becomes carbohydrates. That's because glucose is a primary substrate for energy production, and it can be stored in your muscles and your liver as glycogen. Carbohydrates play two roles when enhancing endurance performance. Number one, they supply a readily available source of glucose in the bloodstream to be used as a substrate during exercise. Number two, they can be stored in your muscles as glycogen, and so are there as a reserve of energy for endurance exercise. So there we have it, guys. Hopefully now you understand a little bit more about how to make the correct choices when deciding your macronutrient intake. I may have said it a bit tongue-in-cheek throughout this video, but it is important, if you don't know what you're doing, to consult a nutritionist. It doesn't have to be me, there are plenty out there, but if you want to, I am available. In the next video I'll be talking about how to time your nutrients appropriately to enhance your performance and to improve recovery. Thanks guys!